Acts chapter 17, verses 16 and 17. However, before coming to them, I will just put things into their context. Paul and Silas had been in prison. Now, I mustn't get distracted by the important events of their prison release. So when they came out, as it says in chapter 16, verse 40, they went to Lydia's house. After encouraging the brothers, they left. And so we come to Acts chapter 17, which records them on their travels. Timothy, who had been left in Philippi, joined them in Berea. In verse 14 we read that the brothers sent Paul to the coast, but Silas and Timothy stayed at Berea. Verse 15. The men who escorted Paul brought him to Athens and then left with instruction for Silas and Timothy to join him as soon as possible. And so we come to my text, verses 16 and 17. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day, with those who happened to be there. Athens, this famous city, renowned for its statesmen, philosophers, historians, poets, painters, and architects. To this came the Apostle Paul. This man, described as being unimpressive in looks and speech, but for all that, was the most successful missionary that the world has ever seen. So we have this great servant of Christ, wonderfully converted, in a city which it says in verse 16 was full of idols. Athens was a stronghold of idolatry. The Authorized Version has that it was wholly given to idolatry. Let's examine what Paul saw in Athens. Let's see what he felt there. And finally, what he did in Athens. Well, he saw idolatry. A city wholly given over to it. Everywhere he looked, he saw idols. As he looked around, the temples of idol gods and goddesses occupied every prominent position. The magnificent statue of Minerva, at least 40 feet high according to Pliny, towered above the Acropolis and caught the eye from every point. A vast system of idol worship overspread the whole place and thrust itself everywhere on his notice. The ancient writer Pausanias expressly says that the Athenians surpassed all states in the attention which they paid to the worship of all gods. as the NIV has it, the city was full of idols. And yet this city, in proportion to its size, very likely contained the most learned, civilized, philosophical, highly educated, artistic, intellectual population on the face of the globe. It was at that time a city of wise men like Socrates and Plato and others. It was the city of mind and intellect, and art and taste. A city wholly given to idolatry. Paul said in verse 23, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. If the true God was unknown in Athens, what must he have been in the darkest places of the earth, such as Babylon, today's Iraq? What should we learn from this? Surely it's for us who know the true God through Jesus Christ to proclaim him wherever and however we can. Looking around England today, is there not an absolute need to declare Christ? How far we are travelling as a nation away from our Christian foundation and heritage. How far away we are from the standards this country maintained to the example for the world. How true is the words of 1 Corinthians 1:21 today? The world through its wisdom did not know God. Wise people, highly educated people in England, many of them do not know God. With all their wealth and their wisdom and their education, many of them do not know God. Do not know their need of the Saviour. Old Athens is a standing lesson which we in 2023 should do well to remember. But what secondly should we learn from this? Being highly educated, for all its benefits, is no security against utter darkness in respect of Christian things. People were highly educated in Athens. The students of Greek philosophy were very educated people. But all this mental discipline did not prevent their city being a city wholly given to idolatry. A follower of Socrates or Plato might have taught eloquently on many subjects, but he could never have answered the jailer's question in Acts 16:30. He could never have answered, what must I do to be saved? In England today, where we know so much, we know so little about the essential reason for life. The minds which designed the temple of Luxor and Karnak, or the Parthenon or Colosseum, were not the minds of fools. The The builders who executed their designs did better and much more lasting work than any contractor can do in modern times. And yet, as Ephesians 5:8 says, are in darkness. But what are we as Christian men and women? We are, as that verse also says, light in the Lord, children of light. The sight which Paul saw at Athens is an unanswerable proof that men and women know nothing which can do his or her soul any good without the gospel, gloriously told, however haltingly we declare it. But then secondly, what did Paul feel in Athens? Well, now we differ as people. Have you ever experienced how the same sights affect different people? One man in those days visiting Athens for the first time might be absorbed in the beauty of its buildings. Another, an orator maybe, by the speeches of the philosophers. A literary person by Plato, and so on and so forth. But a missionary, an apostle of Christ, had, dare I say, higher thoughts. With Paul, one thing above all others swallowed up his attention and made everything else look or seem small. That one thing was the spiritual condition of the Athenian people. That great apostle to the Gentiles was eminently a man of one thing. You see, he stood in Athens and he thought of nothing so much as their souls. Where they stood in relation to Jesus Christ. Paul's spirit was stirred within him when he saw the city wholly given to idolatry. What did Paul feel as he looked at that great city? He was stirred with compassion. It moved his heart to see so many people of knowledge and intelligence lacking a knowledge of God and of what God had done through Jesus Christ. He saw a people who had so much, yet had so little, because they were without God, without Christ, and without hope for eternity. But he wasn't just stirred with compassion. He was stirred with sorrow. It moved his heart to see so much talent misapplied. Here were hands capable of excellent works and minds capable of noble conceptions. And yet the God who gave life and breath and power was not glorified. He was also stirred with indignation. He saw the God of this world blinding the eyes of multitudes of his fellow men. He was also stirred with zeal. Zeal for his master's glory. Zeal for Jesus. He saw Jesus unknown and unrecognized, whilst idols were receiving the homage due to the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Yes, he was stirred with indignation, sorrow, and yes, compassion, zeal. As you and I stand in some great city in England today, what stirs us? What do we see as perhaps we stand in Southampton or Bournemouth? Of course, we see a multitude of religions, but many have none. Or it's just, well, I was brought up but I don't practice it. I don't believe it. People are not necessarily anti-Christian, although some are, of course. And certainly some laws are. But mostly it's an apathy and indifference. So finally, what did Paul do in Athens? What did he do about all this idolatry? How did he respond to what he saw and what he felt? Paul was not a man to stand still and do nothing. He might have thought to himself, but I stand alone. I'm a lone voice. I'm in the minority. He was, of course, a foreigner in a strange land. He might have thought, I'm going to have to oppose the rooted prejudices of learned men. Public opinion is not on my side, but theirs. He might have said that. He might have thought the gospel isn't likely to have any effect on minds steeped in Greek philosophy. He might have done that. He might have thought that. However, none of these thoughts seem to have crossed Paul's mind. He saw people who, for all their cleverness and more, did not have a saviour. He had confidence in the power of his Saviour's message. Something to meet every person's soul, whether or not they are clever or not clever, rich or not rich. You see, this learned former Pharisee had found Jesus. He'd received mercy and forgiveness and a purpose for life and living, and it affected him. He could not keep quiet about the Saviour he found. He had to do something. He had to say something as he looked around and saw the situation as it was. Verse 17 tells us what he did. With wisdom and boldness he reasoned. Day by day he spoke with those who happened to be there. He didn't wait for Silas and Timothy to join him first before doing something. He didn't wait for backup, for those who would support him, for those who would stand by him. He didn't wait for that. He began skillfully reasoning. What a model for us to follow. What did he do? He exposed the folly of idolatry. He showed the true nature of God to the worshippers of images made with hands. He asserted the nearness of God to all of us and the certainty of a solemn reckoning with God at the judgment day. And he preached about something which is distinctive to Christianity. It's there in verse 18. Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. He preached to them Jesus and the resurrection. What is preaching Jesus and the resurrection? Is that not what the gospel is? In preaching Jesus and the resurrection, Paul proclaimed the person of Christ, his divinity, his incarnation, his mission, his life and death, his resurrection, his ascension, his return, his character and teaching, his amazing love for the souls of men and women. That is proclaiming the person of Christ. He proclaimed the work of Christ, his sacrifice upon the cross, and what it achieved: redemption, salvation. He proclaimed the offices of Christ, that Jesus is the one mediator between God and all mankind, humankind. Jesus, the friend of the friendless, the advocate of all who commit their souls into his hands. He proclaimed the only one who had the ability to save to the uttermost all who come to God by him. The one who is ready and willing to forgive and to cleanse and renew. And last but certainly not least, he preached the resurrection. He preached it as the miraculous fact upon which Jesus himself staked the whole credibility of his mission. The resurrection proved that what Jesus Christ undertook, he fully accomplished. That the ransom was accepted, the atonement completed. He preached it as a fact, proving beyond doubt the possibility and certainty of our own resurrection. These things Paul preached in Athens and elsewhere. So what for us? Surely we see how the world and our country is going in respect to Jesus and the resurrection. I need not to elaborate, surely. May God help us never to be afraid to stand alone and be solitary witnesses for Christ, whatever the personal cost. The personal cost could be very great, couldn't it? I mean, it's almost becoming illegal to do it. Preaching the gospel. Not quite there yet, but it's coming. I've been telling people for some years now that I wonder whether I'll end up in prison for what I believe and what I proclaim. So might you. The cost. we have a Saviour, don't we? Oh, yes. What do you see? What do you feel? What do you do? Paul proclaimed Jesus and the resurrection in Athens, indeed in Antioch, in Philippi, at Corinth, and Ephesus. And so have many others since. Athanasius, Wycliffe, Whitfield, Wesley, to name but a few. God help us all to see, feel and do. Let us not be in despair as we see what we wish we did not see or feel. Remember, with God, nothing is impossible. Think of that long list. I've only mentioned a few who have, as it were, carried the cross and been faithful in the midst of great difficulties. Those indeed who have kept the faith and proclaimed the faith and received the well done, good and faithful servant. But you know, when we stand alone, we are not alone, because Christ is with us. Oh, give thanks for your salvation as I give thanks for mine. Be not afraid to stand alone. You see, we face a task unfinished, and that should drive us to our knees, and that's the hymn we're going to sing before we come around the Lord's table. 126 if you're using a book. Facing